All right. Hello, and thank you for coming to Radical Reimaginings, Classics for the 21st Century, which, as you'll see and hear across 4 panels tonight and tomorrow, is dedicated to exploring several basic questions. Why might we want to radically reimagine the discipline of the classics, both in theory and practice? What would it mean to do so? And how might such a reimagining help us navigate our present-day predicaments, dominated, as we are, by ascendant authoritarianism and ultranationalism, fueled by racism, essentialism, and a hashed traditionalism? This symposium is a production of Bisser's Language Learning and Critique program. The name and its wordiness is proportionate to its big ambitions. We seek to integrate intensive formal language acquisition with the critical exploration of the political and cultural contexts in which languages and texts are read. We kicked off a couple years ago with ancient Greek, have added Latin, Sanskrit, Biblical Hebrew, Arabic, and modern German, and hope next year to debut a course in classical Chinese. Meanwhile, we've hosted regular free public lectures on everything from climate change in the Roman world to economics and classical Islam to, coming up September 10th, Friedrich Hölderlin's Death of Empedocles. Ever-growing, Bisser's Language Learning Critique is attempting to put into practice the reimaginings proposed and discussed at this symposium, whereby languages are never dead, but human material perennially worked on and in flux in the present. And here, I'd like to take a moment to thank my Bisser colleagues who continue to help build this amazing program: Michael Stevenson, Seth Rose, Lauren Wolfe, R.T. Mehta, Jean-Ann Ralph, James Redfield, James Wagner, Erin Petrella, and our illustrious, and let's face it, beloved program head, Bruce King, who's right here. I also want to thank the Society for Classical Studies and the Consortium for Humanities, Councils, and Institutes, whose generous grants gave the green light in effect to put this symposium together. And thanks, of course, to our panelists and volunteers. We really appreciate your participation. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge our debt, intellectual debt, to Mathura, Umachandran, and Marcella Ward, whose edited volume, Critical Ancient World Studies, The Case for Forgetting the Classics, provided a framework, indeed articulated the questions and concerns that this symposium will try to tackle. And so, without further ado, I hand it over to Bruce as we kick off Radical Reimaginings, Classics for the 21st Century.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm just gonna introduce our speakers in the order that they're gonna talk and give a super brief introduction to the panel and then turn it over to the panelists. Okay. So Mathura Umachandran is a child of the Tamil Elam diaspora, born and raised in London and its Essex suburbs. Since 2022, they've been a lecturer in the Department of Classics, Ancient History, Religious Studies, and Theology at the University of Exeter. Holding degrees from Wadham College, Oxford, University College London, and Princeton University, they have also held postdoctoral research positions at the University of Oxford and Cornell. While in post at Exeter, they have co-stewarded the Critical Ancient World Studies Collective with Marcella Ward and co-founded the Society for the Study of the Past, as well as taught courses such as Ancient Racecraft, following the implications of Barbara and Karen Field's 2012 Critique of Race for Ancient World Studies, and a class on critical classics and the contemporary world, which introduces undergraduates to classical reception keyed to other than celebratory modes. Until recently, they were co-officer for membership and recruitment officer of the Exeter branch of the University and College Union. After Mathura, Del Maticic will speak. Del is part of the English faculty at the School of the Holy Child in Rye, New York. He has a PhD in classics from NYU and spent 3 years teaching at Vassar. He's written about problems of environment, materiality, and labor in Republican and Imperial Latin literature. In 2024, along with Jordan Rogers, he published an edited volume called Working Lives in Ancient Rome with Palgrave. Prior to leaving academia, he was preparing a second book, tentatively entitled Roman Pessimism, which explored the role that Latin literature played in the history of philosophical and cultural pessimism. Our speaker, and then following, Erin Petrella will speak, and Erin received her PhD in classics from Columbia University. Her research focuses on the history and development of botanical Latin, the scientific ideal of universal intelligibility, and textual authenticity. She has a prior MLS in rare books, librarianship, and has worked for several years with Columbia's Justice and Education program. Hannah Silverblank will speak then. Hannah is a writer, an independent scholar, a practicing diviner, and a caretaker for people, plants, and animals. Inspired by Hecate's three faces, the maiden, the mother, the crone, her craft unfolds in three modes: scholar, mystic, and storyteller. These entangled modes of creative interpretation operate symbiotically through this braided practice. She reads about magic, myth, translation, reception, astrology, queerness, and disability. Her research interrogates modern revivals of Hellenistic astrology and translations of ancient Greek astrological treatises and esoteric poetry, and she weaves these research areas into her speculative composting of ancient practices in the fertile soils of fiction and divination. You can find her published scholarly writing on disability and queerness in Greek literature, in Critical Ancient World Studies, the Classical Receptions Journal, and the Routledge Handbook of Classics and Queer Theory, amongst other venues. And you can read her astrological essays on her Substack, The Trickster's Almanac, and you can learn more about her divinatory practice on her website, hannahsilverblank.com. Our concluding speaker will be Danelle Padilla Peralta, who is Associate Professor of Classics and Associated Faculty in African American Studies and affiliated faculty in the programs of Latino Studies and Latin American Studies at Princeton. He's the author of Undocumented, a Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, and Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic. And he's co-edited Rome, Empire Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation and Making the Middle Republic, New Approaches to Rome in Italy, circa 400-200 BCE. His next book is entitled Classicism and Other Phobias. A couple brief opening remarks. Towards the very end of the Odyssey, after Odysseus' killing of the suitors, Zeus announces a plan that will determine the poem's resolution. Odysseus will be king forever. And there are to be oaths that will bound Odysseus and his kin with the kin of the slain suitors. For the latter, that is the blood kin of the slain, there will be a forgetting, an oblivion of their loss and grief, through which all might join all in new relations of kinship, of philia. Or so says Zeus. There will be, and then he concludes, there will be abundant prosperity and peace. Just prior to Zeus's plan, the grief of the kin of the suitors had been said to be alaston, a word that can mean unforgettable and also unforgetting. In the latter sense, the spirit of vengeance is a personified alastor, an unforgetting fury born from the blood of the slain. On one reading of the end of the Odyssey, the Zeus-imposed oblivion, which might include forgetting Odysseus and even forgetting the Odyssey, might make possible new and more expansive forms of kinship, more capacious, more inclusive, more generous forms of philia and of social exchange. The Furies might themselves finally be slain. At a minimum, Odysseus will not be king forever, and that might be the beginning of a good thing. But we also know, of course, that little, or perhaps nothing, is ever really forgotten, and that the pretense of forgetting is one sure way to summon the alastor, the unforgetting spirit of vengeance, and with exponential force. The damage is double, both to the one who falsely claims to have forgotten, and even more so to those he has claimed to have forgotten. And forgetting is also often the privilege of the victor, whose power is maintained by relegating the past to oblivion. When is forgetting the past, casting off its atavistic holds, a step towards a more expansive, more leba community? And when does forgetting willfully serve the ends of power? These are some of the questions I hope we might now open up. And so I'll turn to Mathura.
Can you all hear me? All right. Thank you very much, Bruce, for the very kind introduction and for setting up the panel, and welcome to everyone. What an odd thing to do with a Friday night in New York City in early September, but I'm grateful for you all being here and looking forward to our conversations over the next day and a half. So the framing of this panel is around forgetting, which is a key move of mine and Cella's book, Critical Ancient World Studies, The Case for Forgetting Classics. And what we mean, and I don't presume that all of you have pored over this text, but I hope there's some passing or nodding acquaintance to the critique that we mount in the book. It's available thanks to University of Exeter's generous funding, open access, so you do not need the physical copy in your hands in order to read it. But forgetting is a central gambit to the kinds of critical moves we hope to launch. Where I think cause is a dynamic, exciting model that links up to our conversations in the next day and a half is that this is an exercise of imagination and that these are gambits. We are trying something different in making moves away from the so-called discipline of classics as it has been set up for the past 2.5 centuries. Now, you don't need the excursus into the history of German philology. I won't give it here. But classics has habits of mind that have allowed it to be complicit with the state of the world as we find ourselves inhabiting. So cause, if you take away anything else from our proposed model, take it or leave it. But at the heart of it is this question. So rather than should we forget the classics as a discipline, mine and Cella's answer is yes, and here is our model, Critical Ancient World Studies. And at the heart of what we propose to do is a different set of questions. So, what kind of histories do we need to write in order that we have justice-orientated futures? So we dedicated this book to a weedy hope that that might be possible. And that weedy hope, given the state of the world, is, I think, the best that we might cultivate. So what do we mean by justice-focused? It means that, and this is terrain that we cover in our introduction, that we are no longer setting aside our politics when we move into the room, and I hope that in a room full of leftists, that our politics are writ large as we want methods of history that we can write such they are not complicit with genocide. We want methods of history that understand and grapple and are engaged with the present and can set the ground up for futures for all of us to be emancipated. Do we have all the answers? No. Do we have a stunning array of chapters? I'm looking at you. Do we have a stunning... And you. And a couple of other people in the room. I read all of your work. We have attempts to undertake a critical project on the field of classics. That's one half of it. And the other half of it is to do the building of critical ancient world studies as an intellectual enterprise that works on the university and apart from it. So one of the things that Cella and I have worked hard to do is to delineate what an activist scholar habit would be. So you'll see Cella on the protest marches on Saturday in Bradford taking up the soapbox. You'll see me on the picket line. Like, we are against the pretense of objectivity such that neutrality is an option for the classical to be weaponized. And I mean literally weaponized. So important questions that I think we should ask are not about whether the disciplinary framework of classics is useful or can be reimagined. We've made our gambit. There are other interesting questions that we might ask, given what I've just said. So, Do we still need universities? Where are the kind of justice-focused historiographies going to be written, and by whom? Are they going to be written in university classrooms? Or are they going to be written, as BISA is predicated on, in online, or in the back room of bars, or I don't know where else BISA teaches, but like not in the hallowed halls. Okay, thanks. How do we be in solidarity with colleagues who are being genocided? That's a decent question to ask right now. How do we be in solidarity? We've decided to set up our own professional organization. It's called the Society for the Study of the Past, because we no longer believe that the Society for Classical Studies, thanks to your generous funding for tonight, or the Classical Association in the UK, has the intellectual resources to answer to the present moment. The time for statements is past. The time for a $500 for acute outreach or DEI activity is past. The stakes are too high, and there is a world to win, and futures that we need to set up, and what can we do as ancient historians or people trained to read ancient texts? Do we have skills as those people to be involved in the projects of liberation? If we are people who have other skills that are needed now, great, let's go and use them. But the question is, the skills that we are trained in, can we bring them to bear on the present moment in solidarity with people whose lives are on the line? Our lives might also be on the line, right? But not in the way that there is not a single university left standing in Gaza. I don't know how much longer I have left to speak. Okay. So when we were setting up this panel, I had just read the Robin Kelley essay in the Boston Review that's responding to Noam Chomsky's What is the Responsibility of Intellectuals, that came out in 2011 after the murder of Osama bin Laden. And to briefly summarize what Chomsky said and that Kelley responds to, Chomsky's saying it's the work of the intellectual in the moment of 2011 to bear witness, to tell the truth. And Kelley responds, those activities are necessary but not sufficient, and goes on to make the argument that we need to cast our lot in with the insurgent class and enter the struggle. For me, the question is how? How do we enter the struggle? With whom? In what way can that be a solidaristic engagement? And as someone who's trained to read ancient texts and has written a whole dissertation on how the reading of ancient texts in fascistic moments of history can be acts of resistance, can we reprise those readings, or do we need to do something altogether different with those texts? Do we need to do something altogether different? So the act of reimagining, as I understand it, is expansive and takes in all possibilities, up to and including we might not do this. This meaning the scholarly activity of reading texts together, if there's more important work to be done. If that reading can happen alongside the important work, great, let's figure out how. But we don't have time to lose. That's the urgency that I feel when I agreed to come and see what Cause could say in relation to reimagining the classics. We've done our critique of it. We have issued it. We're looking at how questions and with whom questions. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll get off the soapbox. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I'm inspired by that and by your work, and I am struck by the fact that the only real antidote to the toxic kind of pessimism, the Friday evening after a long day, a long week, a long life of working pessimism, is gratitude. And I'm grateful to everybody here, and it strikes me that as I'm listening to everyone speaking and catching up with old friends and meeting new ones, that I wish what I had done was write an acknowledgements. And I think it would be handy if we wrote longer acknowledgements and shorter monographs in the things that we publish. Because I don't judge a book by its cover, but I definitely am less inclined to finish reading it if I look and there's like one page, right? And it's the outpouring of gratitude that makes a book worth reading, and I just express so much gratitude for the people here, for people on this panel, for the work that you've done fighting in the front lines of a really particularly toxic domain of my Gmail account, and the support that I have received from scholars for whom I don't really deserve the amount of patience I've received, and I'm thinking of in particular Danelle, and who's writing new knowledge right in this book, and I'm so excited to see Danelle ideas emerging in their rawest form, and I'm thankful to Bisser for providing me with an opportunity to speak as I'll talk about my own career status has changed as I've faced precarious academic employment and I'm now experiencing a career transition. I'm thankful to my partner and their mother for being here. Thank you, Erin and Kathy. It's nice to have an entourage, and I'm thankful for those who are questioning the status quo of academia. You know, in the introduction to myself, which I wrote, it was said that prior to leaving academia, and I've become increasingly fond of describing myself as a former academic. So for those of you who don't know, it was said, I just finished my first week teaching at an all-girls Catholic high school in Westchester, teaching high school English, which is rather far from my training as a classicist. In this transition, I rather like to say that I have left academia. And when I say that, people in the most well-meaning of ways are inclined to say, no, you're still an academic. Look, you're giving talks, you're presenting papers, your books are coming out. But what I mean by departing from academia is not quite that, but rather I don't need you now, right? I don't need you in the same way, right? I am independent of this particular structure of employment and of funding, or at least I'm trying to be. I still want to be part of the intellectual community. That was never really a question, and whether or not your academic category or whether your professional category is academic or not, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you wear that particular scarlet letter, and that is the ethos that I have always practiced from day one of graduate school, when I insisted on serving as on committees and organizing conferences and doing all these things that my advisor says, don't do that, right? Focus on writing your books, focus on doing your research, focusing on tightening up your Latin and Greek, because that is what will get you a job. Like they know, right? Like the people who have proven least likely to tell me what will be viable in terms of one's employment are the people who have the jobs that I was pursuing for many years, and not because they're not well-meaning, but because of a series of fortunate accidents that resulted in them not having to face the particular kind of precarity that I have faced, or having really, really locked in, as the kids say, and were at the right place at the right time as a result of their immense effort. And we all here know how to work hard. And so I come here today, a former academic as I am, continuing in the conversation and excited to do so. Having, as I said, taught this week in a high school, and the way that the high school structure works, for those who are maybe unfamiliar, is that you teach a lot of the same things many times over again. There's a lot of repetition in it, and that's beneficial because there are small classes. And so I teach the same lesson 3 times in one class and another lesson twice in another class. And the experience that I have had while doing that is to experience a certain level of multidimensionality, especially because the school operates on a 6-day cycle, so no every day is the same. Every day is different, every week is different, every class is different, and yet also the same. And coming from that multidimensionality back down to this earth, to this focal point here with you now, is a striking experience. And I think what I've learned in my week of teaching high school, and I'm a pro now, I guarantee you, is that there's a certain extent to which my knowledge, the knowledge that I have from a PhD, is maybe at times counterproductive. I don't necessarily need to explain to the young people that I am teaching that there are at least five different ways of reading this book that you did not read. That, in fact, maybe we just need to pause and take a breath and ask them how they're doing, right? Ask them how they're coping with the stress and the hormones and the trauma of being a young person in a world where we seem so much more concerned about clutching our pearls than actually doing anything about all of the problems. And I found, as I was going, I would go in and I would try to organize all of my knowledge and organize the whole semester of knowledge and really have something to teach them, have a structure, have a form, have a cosmos to hand down to them. A cosmos which is impossible to maintain amidst all the chaos of personal lives and the chaos of a calendar which I guarantee I will understand one day. And I had this moment when I was teaching Circe, the Madeline Miller book, which I had not had the pleasure of reading until this summer when I was supposed to be teaching it, and realizing what a beautiful story of the resilience and the response to trauma the story of Circe is, how you respond to hardship by learning how to change things around you, and you only start to heal when you learn to change yourself. And I am beginning to learn from these young people that I am teaching. It's purportedly an all-girls school, but there is a small but really vocal contingent of non-binary students, and so I will not refer to the student body as girls. These young people are starting to teach me that this knowledge that I have derived from all of my studies may not actually work here, may not actually serve me in doing the moral mission of teaching and not just passing down the intellectual. And that puts me in a precarious position. What is the purpose of all of this research that I have done? What is the value of all of this work that I have done? And there are the toxic thoughts, the dark thoughts, the thoughts we don't listen to, right? The intrusive thoughts that will say, oh, it's all been for nothing. You have made a horrible, catastrophic mistake with your life. You could have been a lawyer now. You could have had a house. You could have had so many things. Life could be so much better than it is, and yet this is what it is. And that is one version of the pessimism or the despair talking, and it's weird to think about that, right? Because had I been a lawyer, had I listened to that angel on my shoulder instead of the one speaking incomprehensible hexameters to me on the left, would have if I had listened to that and gone down that path, life in a sense perhaps would have been better. I would have maybe had a bit more money in the savings account. I might have had two cars instead of one. I might have had any number of things be different. But my life would be better. But people around the world would still be people around the world would still be dying. Genocide would still be happening. The climate would still be being destroyed, and the very technologies that are facilitating my illusion of a comfortable life would still be drinking the oceans dry. And as much as I hate to admit it, the catastrophic mistake of graduate school did hold me accountable in some way. It did teach me some reality of the world, which is that there is suffering and that people, no matter how hard they work, no matter how brilliant they are, will continue to not get what they deserve, will continue to live on the edge of the knife. And at least I can be in solidarity with them. in solidarity with people like this who get it and who are rather wearied with the pretense that this is as it could have been, or that this is the fantasy that the people that trained us had for what the academic life could be. And I think that in that sense it is valuable and it is important. I am still inclined to be a pessimist, a philosophical pessimist. I gave a talk for BISR a few months ago on environmental pessimism in Latin literature, and I buy the pessimistic argument, but of course there is always the will to live, right? Schopenhauer's whole argument is that there's no way it makes sense to continue living, to be hopeful that the world will be better. Of course, things are always going to be awful, and yet we keep going, we keep fighting, and that is the Wille das Leben, the will to live that Schopenhauer was so upset with that kept him going. And I suppose that I am part of the crowd in the sense that I am still here, and that will to live, that will to think, that will to do the work, no matter my title, inspires me after a long day with some very emotional people, come and spend some time with some very intellectual ones. And so I will continue, I'll stop burning the oxygen in the room and hand it over to the next speaker.
Can you hear me? All right, great. So yeah, my name is Erin Petrella. I teach Latin and Greek here at BISR, and I love doing it. So also I see a few of my students here, so hello to all of you. And so yeah, I want to say really quickly thank you to everyone who organized this and to my fellow panelists. And yes, actually also I have been using the cause methodology in my classes and sort of shoving it down people's throats. A few of you here probably experienced that. So also thank you to my students at BISR, because you all kind of put up with me sort of teaching you how to be skeptics. That's sort of my thing. You probably are aware of, have heard that a million times. But I just wanted to say, I have to confess, I was a little bit negative about being on this panel, and I don't want to say anything. Obviously, this is a wonderful event and everything about it, but I was realizing as I was sitting up here, why am I being so negative about this? Why am I so stressed out about this? And I think it's because I don't have any answers to any of these questions, and I feel like being up here, I should maybe have some answers, right? But I don't have any answers to any of this. So I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit from the heart, and I'm just going to, you're going to kind of be with me and be self-reflective with me for a little bit. So obviously I have a degree in classics from a fancy institution, from an Ivy League school, wow, right? But this is pertinent, right? Because those of you who know me and know anything about me know that my path to this field that we call classics is not direct. It's very circuitous and kind of really all over the place, and it took about 20 years to get there. And I can tell you from personal experience that, first of all, I come from a working class environment. I went to very crappy public schools where I learned almost nothing, although somehow I learned a little bit of Latin in the process, because even in the worst public school systems, apparently there's still Latin on the curriculum, which is very bizarre. But I was a gardener, and I got really into botanical Latin because of that. I was, actually, I'll take a little side quest here. Those of you who know anything about botany, or if anybody's here ever worked in that field, you might actually know this, but knowing scientific names of plants, which are Latin, of course, is not just a bragging rights kind of issue. It's actually a way to get more money, all right? If you work on a gardening crew and you know the names of plants, you get promoted, okay? So it actually has actual material consequences for your life. So then I got out of that, and I got into libraries, which I think Bruce mentioned. I kind of laughed a little bit because I was like, wait a second, did you pull that from the BISR thing? But it's actually kind of pertinent too, because the whole reason I got a PhD was because it turned out that the economy had collapsed in 2008, and I was stuck in this terrible job, but I was earning this degree on the side that my union was paying for, and I was like, what am I doing? I want to work with rare books, but you want to work with rare books, you got to know Latin. And I was like, they were like, well, you know Latin from high school. That doesn't work. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll do a postdoc. So Liz Scharfenberger at Columbia was like, do a postdoc here. And then somehow that turned into a PhD. I don't even know how I got there. And so I definitely feel like sometimes I got myself in a little bit of trouble because even when I was applying to PhD programs, I was very upfront about the fact that I did not care if I got a tenure track job. I didn't care at all, and I still don't care. That would be kind of cool, I guess. I don't care. I genuinely love the Latin language and the Greek language. They're beautiful languages. They literally saved my life in many ways. They got me out of a very terrible public school situation. And they got me out of some terrible work situations. But I'm also hyper aware of this field's past and its history. And so this is partially why I think, my approach to teaching these languages is to just say, question everything. You can question even how we approach the cases. You can question absolutely everything about how these languages are being taught to you. So I don't even know where I'm going with all of this actually, but yeah, so we're on a self-reflective journey here. So I think that I'm very, sometimes I overthink things, but I really just want to try my best to approach studying, what we might call the classics, these languages, the literature, the reception of these texts, with as much integrity as I possibly can, and I fail miserably most of the time, I'm sure. So I'm not going to go too far into this because I'm legally not allowed to, actually, but I have worked for a very, very long time in carceral contexts. And so this takes different forms. Sometimes I do art workshops, sometimes I've done library work, right? But I've also done work with classics. So actually, since Bruce brought up the Odyssey, I'll bring up this I can talk about because this happened several years ago. But a colleague and I did a reading of the Odyssey at Rikers with a group of middle-aged men. I think it's pretty much, the perfect group of people to read the Odyssey with. It's a story of homecoming, right? And it got, we only got halfway through and then COVID hit, so we didn't get very far with that, unfortunately. But I in the process of doing that reading, it was really interesting because I got, now again, I've worked in these contexts for a long time, so you get, I would say most people that you work with are very positive and open and happy to do whatever you're doing with them. But you do get people who question you, and that's not fun. It's not fun to have people come to you and say, what are you doing here? Why are you shoving this down my throat, okay? Why are you coming to me? I'm incarcerated and my life has fallen apart, and you're telling me to read the Odyssey. What are you doing? And I think that that's not fun, but I think it's also important to have people challenge you on what you're doing. And I still do it anyway. But I have, again, I've been thinking about that particular sort of a person that I'm thinking about who really challenged me on that. And I realized coming away from it that I'm not going to stop working necessarily with what we would call classical material. I'm not going to stop working in these contexts, but I do now no longer offer what we might call classical material to people who are incarcerated. If somebody who is incarcerated comes to me and says they would like to learn this material, then I say, okay, that's fine, I'll do it. But I'm the first person to offer it to them because I no longer feel like that's right for me to do that. So now I'm going to say something that's maybe not so self-reflective. I actually kind of wanted to bring up some questions for you all to think about. So Mathura had asked this question about, whether or not we still need universities. So kind of going back to, I think this is a really, really, really important question to ask. And of course, obviously, I think a lot of the answers to are extensible to the field of classics itself, right? To what extent do we actually need degrees in classics, right? And the reason I thought that this was such a really interesting question to ask is because, again, going back to my own background, you get treated very differently when you have those 3 letters after your name, and those 3 letters came from an Ivy League institution. Before I got my degree, if I were to get up or sit around and talk to people about certain things, I would not be taken seriously. And the reason why is because according to a lot of people, you don't have authority, all right? So getting a degree grants you authority, whether I don't agree with that, obviously, but that's how it is, right? And so one of the things that I think is worth thinking about, sort of like broadly speaking about whether or not you want to sort of completely turn your back on formal education or turning your back just on the field of classics as it's traditionally been done. Either way, what you're doing functionally is removing authority from yourself and from other people, all right? So this is just something to think about. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say. I might have more things to say later, but.
Hi, everyone. So I left the university a year ago, and since then, I have forgotten how to make remarks. And so as I was preparing for this panel, I was also a little bit stressed. And what I came up with as my stress response to the situation was a fairy tale. And it is called The Hierophant and the Crow. It is bedtime, so should you choose to close your eyes, I would enjoy that. Once upon a time, there lived a demigod named the Hierophant, who lived a happy life of intellectual stability, prestige, and cultural value. He lived in a majestic castle filled with ghosts and disembodied servants. His worshippers praised him for his administration of cultural value and legitimate forms of wisdom, for his stewardship of the highest forms of knowledge, for his critical role in making humanity a more civilized species, one argument at a time. But one day, the Hierophant's work of making sense of the past was interrupted. He woke up to discover that his marbled white skin was beginning to look translucent in a way that unsettled him. When he opened the windows of his ivory tower and gazed out at the world, he could hear the murmurs of mortals everywhere whispering through the winds, saying that he was irrelevant, that they would no longer make sacrifices to his altars. He nervously ran into his vault to check on his treasure chest, only to discover that most of his gold was gone. Without mortal offerings, the Hierophant would lack the resources necessary to fund the institutions and scholars that he needed to make his arguments that structured the world's access to the past. Disturbed, he took a walk in a nearby forest, where he paused to contemplate his reflection in a pool of water. He looked terrible. Even he had to admit it. He had been tossing and turning all night, disturbed by nightmares, in which he met a child in wizard's robes, who told him that a sacred crow would come to eradicate him. The dream offered up an image of a crow holding a book tucked under its wing. The crow yanked up from the earth a rotten root system and dissolved those roots into the dust with her talons. As the image unfurled in smoky meanderings, the voice of the young wizard warned that the Hierophant had assembled all of his prestige and human worship by weaving dangerous stories built on extractive and harmful impulses. The wizard foretold that a hive of creative antagonists laid in wait to dismantle his throne. Gazing into his disturbing reflection and contemplating the previous night's dream, the Hierophant was utterly baffled. "It just doesn't make sense," he said, shaking his head. But as he looked at himself in the pool, as the water's wiggles loosened the contours of his faded face, he began to see himself differently. On his forehead was a sword, emblazoned with the words, "The West." And from the sword dripped blood, both hot and cold, wet and dry, bringing his shape back into focus through its drenching of his tenuous edges. He looked down at his hands, and on them were written the words, cultural value, empire, legitimacy, discipline, and cultural foundations. And he saw that these text-laden hands were gripping a quill and a stone, itself engraved with the words, origin stories. And no matter what he tried, he couldn't seem to let the stone go. He looked upon himself with horror, but he wanted to survive, to reimagine himself. He still had something to offer, he thought. This couldn't be all there was to him. He wanted to get better. And so, the Hierophant went into urgent care to see a doctor. The wait was long, and the waiting room was full of surprisingly scholarly animals, some of whom had armchair diagnoses to offer him. An eagle told him that he needed to gain a global perspective on antiquity, that he was too focused on Greece and Rome. A field mouse climbed up onto his lap and cheerfully told him that he needed to direct more arguments to marginalized people in the ancient world. A newt at the reception desk wandered into his view and suggested that he attend to how later cultures responded to the classical tradition to make himself a little more dynamic and relevant. He could just barely hear the whisper of a snail who suggested accommodating different paces and modes of argument production. A donkey yelled very loudly that he should loosen his grip on the concept of mastery. A crow flew into the waiting room, but before she could speak, the hierophant was called back into a patient room. The doctor told the hierophant there wasn't anything wrong with him, but he seemed to have dangerously low self-esteem due to bullying. He just needed to improve his diet to include more diversity, stay true to his golden roots, and disseminate yet more arguments to his priests and priestesses. If he could do all that while managing to exercise and keep going to work, his body should restabilize. Still, the hierophant felt disturbed. He wanted to stay alive, but he felt his vitality shivering away from him, and the blood which was not his had spread to drape over his entire body. It was starting to make a mess. In desperation, the hierophant went to see an energy healer in a remote shack in the woods. At a crossroads of wooded desire lines, the crow from the doctor's office suddenly reappeared. It swooped down in front of his face and said, "Caw, caw, caw. You are looking for the cause?" "Yes," said the hierophant. "I am looking for the cause of my evanescence. I'm hoping that I can save myself, save antiquity from disappearing, if I understand more about how I got here and how to restore myself, and I'd like to get rid of all of this blood." "No," said the crow. "The answers you are seeking in cause, C-A-W-S, cause being an acronym for Critical Ancient World Studies, edited by the wise Mathura Umachandran and Chella Ward, and written by a ragtag polyphony of collaborative thinkers committed to a form of cooperation that makes bold argumentative claims and engenders speculative alternatives for thinking through your ultimate undoing in the service of more just and liberatory thought worlds." The crow cleared her throat and continued. "Critical Ancient World Studies rejects the fairy tale that you've written in the genre of argument that," and here I quote the words of Drs. Umachandran and Ward, that, quote, "constitutes a mythical prehistory for an imagined West, which rejects the universal as a synonym for the Western, which rejects the inherent equivalence between so-called classics and cultural value, which rejects the fantasy of the scholarly view from nowhere, which remains vigilant to the injustices and epistemologies of power that have shaped the way that certain kinds of knowledge have been constructed as objective within the discipline known as classics, and which makes practical commitments to confronting the inequalities and inequities that structure access to the field, and to rejecting the centrality of ancient Greece and ancient Rome within the study of the ancient world." As the crow read these words, the words themselves made the hierophant start to disappear even faster. "Stop, stop," he cried in despair. "I'll die if you keep reading that. Do you really want to be responsible for dissolving our past into nothingness?" "No," explained the crow. "I want you to dissolve into the compost that we can use to fertilize the soil for telling new stories about time." With that, the crow whistled, and around her gathered a coven of fungi, detritivores, and earthworms, who held the ancient wisdoms of how to dismember dead things in order to make the spiralic cycles of regeneration possible. As this queer coven descended upon the hierophant and began to metabolize the bloody silhouette into minerals, bacteria, and humus, time, with a sigh, slipped out of line and went dancing into the messy pile, into the surrounding woods, and into the sky. Just then, the dreamed child wizard, who was named Antiquities, materialized out of a swarm of flies just above the spot where the hierophant had been composted. The crow flew to the wizard's shoulder, nibbling the immaterial ear with affection. The disparate remains of the hierophant gazed up at antiquities, at the child's shapeless, shifting shape, unsettling, full of indeterminate, partial beauty and terror. The hierophant recognized the prophesying wizard from his dream, and the gaze of the hierophant and the wizard glimmered back and forth in the ongoing dying, until at long last their thirsty looking was interrupted by a new crowd that had gathered in the wood, eager for nutrients. In this noisy throng breathed the activists who tell old stories to save new lives, the ASL translators adapting the ancient plays, the ragtag group of amateur lexicographers, the teachers, the students, the critics, the weavers, the occultists, and the healers, and they all began to enmesh their workings with the ancient into a new forest garden of antiquities. They gladly accepted what nutrients they could draw from the compost heap to nourish their entangled story worlds that are made wise with their interdependency, their contingency, their fallibility and vulnerability, their refusal of mastery narratives, their openness to permanent metamorphosis, to sparagmos and rebirth. Story worlds that eschew epistemic certainty, even while they bravely hold the memory of violent pasts and their complicities in genocidal presence. Story worlds that lean into the fictionality of argument, the creativity of interpretation, the spell of language. Story worlds that float through and beyond ivory towers. Story worlds that are birthed through messy collaborations and a belief that the death in dead worlds is compost that is never waste, but always offerings for sacred rebirthings still to be imagined. The end.
I ain't beating a Fable, so I think we should just call it quits. So I am very happy to be in your company tonight. Dell made a joke about ideas in their rawest form, and boy, are mine raw, but we will proceed. So co-writing with my colleague Monica Huerta over the past 2 weeks or so has helped to recharge me after a deflating summer. The output of this co-writing is now out in the pages of The Nation in the form of a letter to students, just in time for the start of the academic year. Another experiment in genre, not to rival the Fable that we just heard, but it shadows forth some thoughts that I'll attempt to work through in my time with you all tonight. So these days I have tarried in the company of Hannah Proctor's Burnout, which is a great book, I recommend. But another text has also been calling me, as well as a memory from some years ago. Back in 2020, at a time of strife in my corner of the institutional ecology and of struggle beyond the gates, a colleague wrote in solidarity and affirmation. Since, she said, words failed her, she offered the next best thing, the words of June Jordan, and specifically 2 paragraphs from Jordan's 1975 essay on the clear and present danger at Yale that I am pleased to read out to you now. But what is this sudden rush, Jordan wrote, to the cause of freedom? Where is the evidence of Yale University's commitment to freedom? What freedom does this institution care about? Is it the freedom to maintain traditions based upon hundreds of years of genocide, theft, rape, humiliation, and hypocrisy? Is it a freedom to project a respectability for the forces of conservatism, social, political, academic conservatism, the conservation of bloody, terrifying, life-destroying, arrogant traditions of a self-appointed elite of the world? Is it the freedom, oh, my handwriting is bad, to save the status quo, the unearned privileges of unearned stolen wealth, the preferential meanings of the accidents of class and color, the perspectives, the policies, and the killer practices of the CIA, FBI, U.S. Armed Forces, General Motors, Esso, Gulf, Bank of America, status quo? Show me the freedom that this university upholds. Show it to me in its admission policies. Show it to me in its financial aid programs. Show it to me in its curriculum, in its required readings, in the color, the sex, the viewpoints of its faculty. Show me this freedom that this institution holds dear. As I said, the crux of the matter is not freedom of speech. That is the misbegotten propaganda propagated by our enemies. The crux of the matter, the clear and present danger to our very lives, points to a far more fundamental issue. It is the issue of life against death. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, among them life. Life! Life! The freedom to live, the freedom to stay alive, the freedom to make life, the freedom to bring new life into and among our lives, the freedom to choose and possess life, and again, life. Next to this fundamental freedom, the freedom to be alive and to perpetuate our own lives, what is something called freedom of speech, end quote. The memory of a summertime immersion in June Jordan, the truest gift of black study from the hands of one of its most unfailingly expert practitioners, washes over me as I contemplate the wretched endgame to which the right-wing superstructure of American politics and their piously centrist cozeners in the media and the academy have brought us. Under cover of appeals to their freedom of speech, to their freedom to express viewpoint diversity, they have compromised our freedom to live and flourish. This superstructure and its columnar supports rest strong and secure on the foundations of capital and financialization, with seemingly every resource at its disposal for ensuring its propagation. It would do us well to sit with Jordan's figura etymologica, propaganda propagated. The adversarial structure multiplies and proliferates with the management of enablers to guarantee its flourishing. The relevance of the superstructure's success at proliferation to our convening tonight is simply this. It has attained such hegemony as to render questions about the survival of ancient studies almost irrelevant, at least in the form that these questions are customarily posed. To lightly paraphrase the Palestinian poet Musaba Butoha in Forest of Noise, the best minds of our generation are being bombed in tents. The best minds of our generation are also being rounded up by mass paramilitary outfits for immiseration and degradation in detention centers, or evicted and forced to live out the most humiliating dramas of dispossession and bare life. And here I want to shout out Brian Goldstone's There Is No Place for Us, which will sear you into steaming and righteous wrath like nothing else. Everywhere we turn, the material and geopolitical conditions for the vital exercise of what Ignacio Sanchez Prado has called the right to an intellectual life are in short supply. And don't at me with stories of past miseries that yielded now romanticized intellectual triumphs, Auerbach in Istanbul or whatever the fuck, or like I am writing this while Mike Jones is still tipping floods my ears. I was working on this earlier today, and wondering how long I have before the end, and feeling that peculiar concoction of shame at the mere luxury of writing and anticipation of the day that even the writing is denied to me. Nor has it offered much comfort to hold close Marx's gentle admonition to Arnold Ruge that shame is a revolution in itself. I'm still claiming for those clamoring for those resources, intellectual as well as material, by which I, in solidarity with others, may work with and through our shame to make possible a new world, and finding that it is desperately hard to bring those resources to the table. The critical resource to which I have gravitated more and more of late takes shape at a disciplinary crossroads and is a deliberate pushback to the faux or pseudo-secularism of classical studies as historically constituted and transmitted on either side of the Atlantic. I say faux or pseudo-secularism because, as the work of Cella and the enterprise of critical ancient world studies more generally has continued to teach us, the construct of ancient Mediterranean studies that comes online in the ratio-nationalist colonialist enterprises of the 18th to 21st centuries is studded with religious disavowals, of which Islamophobia is among the most persistent. In striving against the putatively secularist formation into classics that characterized my own matriculation into the field, which occurred at the same time that the Catholicism of my upbringing presented itself as an object for scrutiny and exegesis, I am circling around a topic that at first blush may have little to offer the material devastations and ravages of the present moment that I specified earlier. That topic is holiness. I'm not thinking of holiness in a strictly individualistic sense, as an attribute, ideal, or actual of a particular self or selves. This idea holds relatively little purchase for me, and in any case, Susan Wolf, in a 1982 paper that I like rereading, made a persuasive case for seeing, and I'll quote Wolf directly, moral perfection, in the sense of moral saintliness, as not constituting a model of personal well-being towards which it would be particularly rational or good or desirable for a human being to strive, end quote. My inclination instead is to take up a collective summons to holiness of the kind formulated, to name one well-studied ancient example, in the Hebrew Bible's priestly code, as a spur to a different kind of political theorizing. For more local purposes, though, I want to focus my energy in the remaining minutes on thinking with holiness as an invitation for revisiting the field, or whatever it is that we might call the field, or whatever may remain of the field after the present ravages. You shall be holy because Yahweh your God is holy. This is Leviticus 19:2, which, taken together with other exhortations to holiness in Leviticus and also in Numbers, encodes the practice of collective holiness as proceeding from a kind of mirroring of that which is presumptively holy, in the sense of set apart. One obvious difficulty with grafting onto this paradigm of holiness is that it requires the identification of an entity external to the political community, in this case God. You can also think of the young wizard, who is invested with the capacity to summon that community to holiness in its image, to interpolate that community as holy, as it were. To be sure, this holiness of the kind that I'm thinking about is divisible into a series of political acts, any one of which could potentially be efficacious for the kinds of ends that we have in mind. We might think of holiness as a principle of self-authorizing sovereignty, or holiness as a principle of election, or holiness as a praxis of standing apart in order to stand together, and so on. But this politics requires the identification, or at the very least the workings, of some kind of God device, and for that reason it's not quite palatable to my take today. I'm going to propose an alternative, something that has stood out to me as potentially generative of a different way of thinking about possibilities for what we do together. And it comes from a different corner of the Mediterranean world. It comes from a corner of the Mediterranean world that I profess some responsibility for teaching. And that is the idea of sacrosanctity in the Roman historical tradition. This institution, which Rome's historical tradition credited to the early decades of the Republic, came to be wielded to spectacularly bad consequence by a host of people, culminating in that non-tribune Octavian, who later received the title Augustus. That history is relevant, but it's somewhat incidental to what I'm about to do. I'm thinking of sacrosanctity as a speech act. I'm concerned mainly with its efficacy as it takes shape around a vow. The vow of the plebeian community to protect the physical inviolability of their elected representatives with their lives. And it is that vow that sacralizes, that sets bodies apart. Note, though, that here the guarantor of sacrality or holiness is not external to the political community. It is the political community. And note also the galvanizing and politically authenticating form of the oath as a spur to the realization of a civic subjectivity that is prepared to stake its life on the idea that some persons ought to be inviolable, made sacred insofar as they are to be shielded from bodily harm. The move I want to make is to reverse the direction of sacralization. I want to move away from prioritizing the sacralization of elected representatives. Boy, wouldn't one elected representative particularly be very happy about that. And towards the most vulnerable, because most disempowered members of our communities. If you're familiar with your Roman history or its receptions and permutations, you may recognize this as a move to cut out the middlemen. Forget the tribunes as sacrosanct for the express purpose of intervening to protect the most disempowered, and embrace instead the collective organizing that would authorize any one of us to intervene vigorously on behalf of the most egregiously violenced, whenever and wherever we who are in a position and with the capacity to act find ourselves. But, and here's the rub, I'm not advocating for some glorified bystander protocol here. I am advocating for a continuing praxis of speech acts by which we swear to hold as inviolate the lives of the most structurally vulnerable. In other words, to practice the kind of ritual that would sacralize bodies. You may sense here a kinship with the clarion call of the Combahee River Collective, but with a twist. The exhortation is not to engage at the register of the levelly human, but rather to practice a species of sacralization that takes seriously the proposition of pledging our lives to defend the most vulnerable and to hold ourselves mutually accountable to elevating their bodies as sacred above everything else. In the process, I would be undoing, I don't know, Agamben and all these people who write about soccer or whatever. They're sort of irrelevant to the work I have in mind. What I am trying to do in thinking about this out loud with you is entertain the prospect of querying and extracting from whatever meager remains the professionalized study of the ancient Mediterranean world has provided us, something that might structure our collective organizing in the contemporary moment. And I can think of nothing that is more efficacious for the purposes of sacralization than the oath that we take together in order to defend the lives of those who are most vulnerable. And that is where I would end. Thanks.
And now we can open up for discussion. So I'll just look for hands as they appear. Questions, responses? Okay, and we've got a mic up here too. And so questions, responses to the remarks of any of our panelists are welcome. Yeah. But maybe we can meet you halfway.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for talking with us tonight. My question for you is short. I'm not sure if it's simple, but my question is, what do we do now? Do we get rid of the university? Do we focus on defending the lives of the vulnerable? Do we focus on stop pushing classics on people? Is it enough to make the classics accessible to everyone? Or should we, to return to the name of the panel, forget it entirely? So my question is, do we stop reading classics? Does the next generation not know of Homer? Or do we try and change the field to make it accessible for everyone?
Can I say something? I don't know if this is a great answer to that, but I would say in terms of just not bothering to study classics, I would caution people against that. And I'll give you a little anecdote as to why I'm going to say that. I was doing kind of Google fooing recently because I found out from a colleague of mine who's a botanist that they actually have been teaching botanical Latin in several universities in China, which I hadn't realized. And so this course led me down a rabbit hole, as happens when you're Googling things. And I found this article all about sort of like the history of classics and classical studies specifically in China and the reasons why it has developed and become really particularly popular, and various departments have developed at universities since the 1990s. And I was sort of a little bit shocked, but actually completely not surprised to find out that one of the reasons why classics apparently, and also I'm perfectly happy to be called out on any of this because I am most definitely not an expert on this, but apparently there was a particular Chinese scholar who's a classical scholar who had translated Leo Strauss. Everybody's familiar with him, right? And does everybody know what his big thing was? The Critique of Modernity, right? And argued against basically everything that we now are arguing for, and pretty much all the values that everyone in this room has, right, in favor of basically the values of antiquity, right? And so apparently it seems that for a certain contingent of people in China, the study of the classics is a way of circumventing modernity, and the sort of like the corrupting influences of the West, right? So this is so why do I bring this up, right? Because the problem is when people who have, we all agree, as you said, hopefully everybody here has pretty much the same politics and the same values, right? When you walk away from this, unfortunately, other people step in to our place, okay? And that's also happening here. Every single person who everybody here knows about the appropriation of this field by the far right and what's going on, right? So I think that this is just something to think about. If you walk away from it, somebody will take your place. So.
It's a very quick answer. I think reading as many things as one has time to read is worthwhile enterprise. Of course, we have to prioritize because we can't read everything. But in terms of the prioritization, what should we do next? Don't tell my supervisors at the school this, but if every now and again one of my students decides to write a paper with ChatGPT and use that time they would have spent writing to take a nap and do a little bit of self-care, I won't tell if you don't.
Man, I'm reading so many ChatGPT papers. Well, so I mean, the one thing I'll say, Jack, is that I would want to keep pretty clear the distinction between reading Homer and operating within a field that authorizes reading Homer as having some kind of like value, like whether capitalizable. I mean, and we have had a discussion already that we could certainly return to on our panel about the extent to which capital accrues to those who are formed within and authenticated by a process that's linked to the field's institutionalization within the university. So people are going to read Homer. I mean, I think people should be struggling to like bring an end to the kinds of state perpetrated suffering that we're seeing now. But like that's not incompatible with reading Homer. Like, you know, people have a right to an intellectual life, which is like one of the things that I see as central to defending. At the same time, though, I am cognizant of the extent to which, and this is why I use the language of hegemony with intent, we are on the other side of a battle that has already yielded a clear victor. So, like, to put it another way, like, these motherfuckers have won. I'm not here to tell you that, like, we're still fighting, and they have won. And like by they, I refer to like the superstructure that I referenced earlier. They have to gently invoke Westworld. they have won in biblical fashion. So the question that is active for me is like, what are we to do on the other side of that? Like one council could be just a council of despair. Like, oh, you know, okay, well, that's that. It's fine. We are called, I think, to rebuild and to reimagine as transgressively as possible. But it must proceed from the recognition that they have commandeered every conceivable resource of capital available to propagate and perpetuate, and that we are in a fugitive and extractivist mode necessarily. Like we are called in the very best Moten and Harney sense to steal from the university. As to your point about universities, I mean, one corollary of what I've said about the superstructure having already won is that, well, universities as we know them are ceasing to exist. What might come next is anyone's guess, I mean, I think we have many, like a sort of collective intuition about what is coming or what is already on the horizon. But universities are undergoing a sea change of such extraordinary proportions that to even commit to the proposition of like saving or rescuing the university now seems to me like misguided. Like what we would, I think, be better served to do is think about how we might create institutional structures for furthering the kinds of knowledge that are exemplified by this room. Now, there is a case to be made that like what is happening in this room it cannot be thought of as separable from the university as some kind of authenticating institution, and I'm prepared to like have a conversation about that too, but what is happening in this room certainly has greater promise to me than like the gutting of Oregon's humanities programs. Like, I mean, like, I don't see much hope in that. Like, so that's where I would say that, again, taking the perspective that there is another horizon beyond the horizon of this defeat, but also acknowledging that a defeat has happened and that there is a change underway is instrumental to the purpose of organizing effectively.
I would only yes, and that the part of the task of now is reducing how much suffering happens in the transition between those horizons. So whether that's taking care of people in your community, whether that's helping someone avoid eviction, whether that's organizing in such a way to recognize that a defeat happens over. Defeat is not a one-time event. The other thing I was thinking about is that I think, and I've been talking with friends about this over the last few days as we start on a new academic year, that the events of the encampments around the world of spring 2024, we won't see that repeated again. And what that represented was an attempt to push back against a hegemonic world order from within the university. So yeah, do we need universities? No, but are they sites at which the struggle that I was talking about, or Robin Kelly was talking about, is that one potential site? Absolutely, yes. And who's going to be organizing on it? Students are. People who recognize themselves as workers, people who stand in solidarity with those people. If that happens to be members of faculty with our fancy degrees, then sure. So I guess what I'm saying is there is no shortage of work to be done. It's just what work you want to do and what we're prepared to do together.
Can I steal this? Is that okay? Yeah, I kind of want to half answer your question. I know that's not allowed. Sorry, I'm not so good with rules, it turns out. But the way I want to half answer your question and also ask a question is by quoting something that the Palestinian academic Rafat al-Arya said shortly before he was murdered by the Israel occupation forces. He said, "I'm an academic. The toughest thing I have in my house is an expo marker. But if the Israelis come, if the occupation comes to murder me, I will throw that expo marker at them, even if it's the last thing that I will ever do." Rafat al-Arya obviously is now a martyr. He's what we would call a shaheed in Arabic, and now that makes me think about actually whether the sacralization of the bodies that are most oppressed by occupation is actually already ongoing in the Palestinian liberation struggle, and whether that actually might be a better way into the idea of sacralization than maybe the Hebrew Bible or anywhere else. But the reason I bring up Rafat, who was a Shakespeare scholar before he was murdered by the occupation, the reason I bring him up is because I think he helps us to distinguish between two types of things that we can do now, right? The types of things that Mathura just alluded to, which are things that everyone can do now. You know, that's to say boycott, divestment, and sanctions. You know, you can stop drinking Coca-Cola. You can go to a protest. You can defend your next door neighbor from ICE agent. All that stuff we can all do by virtue of being human beings, having different kinds of positionalities, but being able to weaponize them. What Rafat was making reference to specifically, I think, was the thing that we can do because of the fact of being academics or intellectuals or whatever phrase we want to use, because I don't think it's necessarily tied to the university, but being people with expo markers in our hands, it puts us in a different position, right? You've got expo markers that you can throw, and I think then the question is, what is the expo marker a metaphor for? And I think it's a metaphor for all of the ways that because you have, whether willingly or not, been inhabited, right, been haunted by this ghostly thing that we call classics, you have got certain weapons at your disposal against something like an occupation that other people perhaps may not have. So I think for me, you know, and that might be, can you transform a narrative? It might be, you know, in the case of Rifat's expo marker, it might be, can you reject the idea of an ethno-nationalist state that is murdering Palestinians, for example? You know, there are all sorts of various ways that we can see what that expo marker might mean. But I guess that would be my question to all of you, would be, where do we find those expo markers, and how do they help us to feed the forest, for example? Thanks. Who do I give this back to?
Am I supposed to answer that? I also feel I'm lacking answers, and I think that I also would like to separate the ideas of what we read and classics, as has been discussed already. I would also like to point out, I suppose, that there are intellectual grassroots communities that are even more disseminated and less institutionally affiliated than what's happening here. And there's a lot of struggle within those communities. So I'm thinking, for example, this is like a kind of segue into a different topic, but I'm thinking of sort of like spiritual pagan communities that are looking at ancient texts to fill out their spirituality in new ways. So they're translating things that classicists haven't been interested in, and they're looking away from classicists and actively avoiding conversation with classicists and actively avoiding even reading classic scholarship because of various forms of violence that they perceive within it. And that gives absolutely no answer to Cella's question. It speaks back to the previous question, which is just to say that as I ponder the question of what the role of universities is and what's good about it, one thing that I've noticed as someone who's left is the lack of resources to study and to think is a problem. So the call of the university, like the siren song that still gets me, is the time to think, the access to materials, and the money to experience the kinds of comforts that make thinking possible. So I think that's on my mind a little bit as an answer to the first question. I'm so much more compelled by Cella's answer than what I've just said, and I hope that the conversation returns there, but that's what I have to contribute.
Yeah, I'm struck by the expo marker image because all this week I've been making jokes to my students about how they should throw them at me if I go on a tangent or say something too obscure and confusing. And I just wanted to sort of, I made the glib joke about ChatGPT, and I just want to acknowledge I'm well aware of the sort of complex problem that this poses. And the point of my joke, and I think this is what I think the expo marker has to say from my neck of the pedagogical woods, is that sometimes what the most vulnerable people need that we can give them is closing the marker and setting it down and saying, let's have a pause to all of the work and rest. I've been spending a little bit of time with disability studies research, and there's a notorious article from the 1990s advocating for the rights of people with disabilities to eat a bunch of donuts and take a nap. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that because one of the things that strikes me most about coming back into academic spaces, having spent even a little bit of time away, is not the time that you have, but the time that you use and how hard you work and how impressive you all are. I'm listening in awe of this group, and I'm looking at all of you in awe. And there are so many people to whom I feel so inferior in so many ways. And there are so many ways that I feel vulnerable right now in my body, and I choose to continue talking because of that vulnerability. And I am so aware that so many of my students feel the same way about me, that they see me and they hear me talk, and they're impressed by me, and they feel inferior, which is ridiculous, right? And I recognize that one of the things we can do as academics with our markers is recognize that vulnerability, recognize how hard people are working, and just pump the brakes a little bit and give people time to rest, because I think that there's that academia has this way of forgetting just how hard it works, and we, and as individual sort of producers in the knowledge industry, forget just how hot the gears get in the grind. And so I think that's part of what I wanted to say, just to be aware of our own positionality and the perspective that just how hard we're working and how hard the struggle is can make people who really are not in a place to do that struggle feel even more exhausted. And that has something to say about the sacrosanctity of the vulnerable and marginalized body that I can't wrap up in a bow, but I thought that it was worth saying and reiterating that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is take a nap, and as my partner would say.
I don't think the expo marker is a metaphor. Throw the damn marker. Throw the damn shoe. You know? Like, but I take the point. The act of genocide that haunts me the most is the burning of the Jaffna Library in 1987. That's the year that I was born. The Jaffna Library held an unparalleled number of manuscripts written on palmyra leaves. And it was the treasure house of the Tamil language. Let me leave that in the air while I tell you about an article I wrote in 2017 that kind of made my career, in which opens with a conversation with my grandmother, who asked me why I read Greek and apparently get paid for it, but don't even really speak Tamil that well, and certainly don't read it. And, you know, that article thinks about the stakes of how we learn classical languages, why we learn them, etc. It's a good piece of writing, I would say. And I was fucking pissed, by the way. It was 2017. It was a bad time to be a brown person at the dawn of fascism in this country. I mean, I was fine, but it was also a bad time. That's to say, and I think this goes to what Hannah was saying, the resources of being able to study anything, the resources of having access to language learning hasn't been historically available to all of us in the same way. I know that's really obvious, but like when I think about the burning of that library, how was I supposed to know? How was I supposed to, with my big language brain, learn Tamil, except at being scolded by my grandma to cut the okra a different way, or by my music teacher to put my hands differently on a certain instrument? Like, I guess I'm just, this is not a self-regarding question, and I'm well aware that I get paid by a fancy university in the UK, right? Like, where does the knowledge production happen? With whom are we going to do it? And the encampments is one place, in our communities is another. The expo marker, when we think about where knowledge has had to be made, intense in the rubbles and the ashes of libraries that have been burned down, like, that's what I'm talking about. And I also shout out to the point that, like, I wouldn't be here if I thought that the so-called discipline of classics was synonymous with what we can do with these ancient texts. My question is the reading of ancient texts useful to us now, given that we want to depart from this disciplinary apparatus? That, I think, has to be our starting point from the other kinds of like ethically guided questions up to and including expo markers that we have to wrestle with.
Other questions, responses, thoughts, observations from, yeah, Noel.
What aspects of the ancient world are most promising in terms of reconception?
Help me with promising.
What are the things in the ancient world that would be easiest to reconceive of now? What aspects of the past would be most promising in terms of reconceiving now in order to change the present and the future?
I teach a course that I trialed this past spring term in Exeter. Devon, the county in which Exeter is in, is 96% white, and I let my students know that statistic as on the first day of term. Like, I'm in a room full of white people trying to teach about race in the ancient world. Okay, let's just start with that fact. The things that emerged as most interesting for me, being a teacher on this time and trying to impart something, was how to grapple with ethnocentrism, right? So if we don't think that race is a transhistorical analysis that can be perfectly mapped onto the past, I was interested in what logics of racecraft, and this is where the Barbara and Karen Fields analysis comes in use, right? Like, in different historical moments, there are going to be different ways in which these sortition mechanisms are going to happen, right? So for the Fields sisters, they look at 19th century American slavery contexts. Okay. I'm trying to think through, when we take up Herodotus not as the father of history, and not in the Jonathan Hall, Edith Hall, like, there's something to do with ethnicity here. What if we actually cut to the matter and said, actually, there's ethnocentrism happening here? And what mechanisms of ethnocentrism, for instance, why is it that Herodotus spends so much of the first part of Book 2 of the Histories talking about how fucking weird the Nile is? Why does it inundate every year? Why does it do that? Why is it so strange? And what correlation does it have to the particularities of Egyptian culture? So this is not a kind of phenotypical analysis of, in the line of, the ancients also had a concept of blackness. That's like a separate kind of discussion. We're trying to understand what logics of ethnocentrism in here, in supposedly someone that the students, by the time they've come to their third or final year of studying a classics degree, have understood him at like someone who has kind of funky Greek. You know, he's not writing in beautiful Attic Greek. He's writing in the midst of the so-called Ionian Revolution. Okay, fine. When we set aside these things and actually try and uncover what logics of, and these are not neutral logics, is the sort of thing that I want to impart to my students when I start with Herodotus by saying, like, we're in historical disciplines and I'm telling you that the study of racial logics are historically situated and mediated. We go to Herodotus not as a father, but to determine critically how he was already doing these sortition mechanisms. And that's a revelation for me, because honestly, I will tell you, as a first-year Oxford undergraduate, I walked into a tutorial and I said to Peter Darrow, rest in peace, okay, Peter. Hey, I want to read Herodotus over the summer vacation, and I've heard of this guy, Edward Said, and I think there's something Orientalism-y going on. Who should I read? Like, I'm prepared to sit at home and read all of this in translation, however much Greek you want to set, and where should I start? Can you show me what parts of Orientalism I need to read in order to understand this Herodotus better? Peter, to his credit, was like, I mean, go nuts. Like, come back at the beginning of your second year and we'll see how much Greek you've got through. Okay. But I want to be the kind of teacher that sets the syllabus, knowing my Said, knowing not just Orientalism in a superficial way, but knows how to put Herodotus and Said into conversation such that my students are better equipped to go out and spot logics of racial sortition in the world. And so that course ends with kind of the popularism of contemporary British political culture that would seek to do these kind of like otherings with ethnocentrism as that kind of mechanism. If I've taught them properly in this 96% white place, they'll be able to, like this, I'm not directly teaching critical media skills, but I'm asking them to be better readers and understanders of this world. And if Herodotus is part of that package, cool. But you're going to read Said, and I'm going to show you how.
I struggled a little with your question. This is why I requested clarification, because what I find interesting may not be promising, but even more to the point, I think for the work of transformation that we may want as a collective to commit to, there's like a summons to like a kind of hyper-particularism that can manifest in like any corner of the ancient world, and that would be fine. So what do I mean by that? I want to come back. I want to circle first to Mathura's point about training better readers. I find that most of the time I'm teaching basic literacy, like straight up. I say that because I feel my students have been profoundly disserved. That one of the most like transparently criminal injustices is the extent to which they have been taught not to read. So, you know, like some days I wonder too about like the extent to which my own skills at literacy are being eroded by the convergence of multiple phenomena acting on my mind. But like I most of the time I'm in classrooms trying to get people to think about the ways that meaning actuates itself through texts in a host of different genres across many different timescales. And that can take the form of like, you know, quote unquote literary texts. It can take the form of inscriptions with which I spend a great deal of time. But I have tried over the past few years to be less prescriptive in setting out what I see as like the sort of most promising lines of inquiry for the kinds of work that might be transformative to students. And instead to try to sort of glean from what I can about their aptitudes and preferences, like where I may be best positioned to offer them something that might help them become better readers, right? So, I mean, if we want to talk about things that I find interesting, like the Bissor folks, many of you may know that I'm like really fascinated by locusts in the ancient world. And so like lately I've spent a lot of time like in the weeds of like entomological literature and all this stuff. But often I find that what has been sort of most instructive for my work with students of the undergrad and high school at the variety, this has been thinking about questions of historical erasure and of forgetfulness and of amnesia. So this past summer, we launched this initiative with some support from the Teagle Foundation to work with high schoolers in Mercer County, and specifically high schoolers recruited from 2 schools. And for our 3-week course, we did a unit that focused in part on practices of forgetting. That was key to one of the texts that we were reading. And one of the thoughts that occurred to my co-instructor and me in preparing for one of our sessions was that we had this sort of ready-made opportunity to help them think locally about where they might see clear signs of historical erasure. And our way to that was get them each to think about indigenous presence and ghosting in Mercer County and in greater New Jersey. I was like, okay, so look at all these Lenape-Munsi names that you encounter on an almost daily basis. And they're like, what? What names? I was like, well, you know, Metuchen and Rahway and Secaucus, like Ramapo, we could just sort of keep going. And so it emerged in the course of that conversation that 2 of the 14 students had been spending a lot of time singly thinking about their indigenous backgrounds in Central America and the fact that one of them came from a town whose name was, we found out when we did some work together, a Spanish translation of a Mayan Quiche name, and that she had been admonished when she was young that it was not a language that she should learn, and that she was now coming to grips for the first time with the recognition that this might be something valuable and transformative for her to know. So we were plugging into the local specific knowledges that attach to different precincts of what has come now to be called New Jersey and what has come now to be called Mercer County, even as we also, by way of routing our collective engagement through ancient texts, revisited sites of forgetting and historical obliteration and of collusions with power that were alive for our students in very contemporary moments. And so I'd like to think that this is like an area where there might be some real critical energy, right? But I would disavow any generalizing claim that this might be promising for the simple reason that I think such a formulation invites us to instrumentalize the practice of teaching in ways that I find counter to my own ethics. So like that's why I've like pushed back slightly on that framing, although I take to heart the invitation to think in these lines.
No, that's fair. I only meant what were the easiest political points to
I can respond a little bit with not something I think of as so promising, but something I find really useful from the ancient world that I use in my daily life and my work as an astrologer, which is an ancient astrological idea of the 6th and the 12th house, or the 6th and the 12th place, which are parts of the birth chart of someone who is born and thinking about the moment they were born and what it has to tell them about how to narrate their life or think about their life. And everybody has a birth chart, and in everybody's birth chart, there's 1/6 of it that is devoted to your illness and your disability, your unraveling, and the sort of shadowy parts of existence that that are often ignored in late capitalist productive sorts of cultural modes. So one of the things that I really like about working with Hellenistic astrology is this idea that it's given me to think through my own relationship to my crip identity and work with clients who are coming into crip identity in new ways, is that even though I actually totally loathe the way that, for example, Vettius Valens talks about the 6th and the 12th house, it opens up a kind of conversation in which we can talk about how disability, illness, and all of the associated concepts of interdependence and the kinds of community that needs to be born in response to experiences of disability and disablement. I found a new way of feeling through that and talking about that with myself and my clients through an ancient model and through the way that modern astrologers, especially Johanna Hedva and Alice Sparkley Cat, have been thinking with the 12th house. So I don't know if it's promising, but it is like a light that I follow. So that would be one example of what I would offer in response.
Yeah, over here.
Hi, this is great in so many ways. I'll go back to the idea of forgetting the classics or reimagining them, especially in the context of university systems. Given, as a parenthesis and as a condition, that forgetting the classics, and by classics, the Greek and Latin classics, is kind of a luxury of the Anglosphere in many ways, in countries where these academic systems are not enmeshed in larger networks, right, of high school teachers, of middle school teachers in some cases, of heritage professionals and so on, right? So this is something that's really limited to one part of academia in many ways. Even though if there is a case also in other contexts, but even given that, so that it is kind of a luxury, at the same time, I grew up with Latin and Greek. I did 5 years in high school, and then I continued, and then I dropped it. I'm doing other stuff, luckily. But I've been taught to learn that Greek and Latin are a very powerful tool in a lot of ways. This is what they train you to think in Italian high schools most of the time. But there is an effective part of that, meaning that half of the words that we're saying in this conversation come directly from Greek and Latin, and not the everyday words, but the kinds of words that signal a certain kind of authority, signal that you're taking part into a certain tradition, all these kinds of things. And learning and teaching Greek and Latin allows you a really powerful tool for intellectual critique in so many ways, because like it or not, the way we talk intellectually is derived from a certain tradition that goes back to Greek and Latin. And so there is really a case for reimagining the classes, and in so many ways forgetting them, because there's so many parts of them that are disgusting, especially when it comes to Roman ideology. But it is still very useful to think through these tools. So question is, how do you reimagine and rethink without renouncing to these very important tools that can be very important for political debates, intellectual debates, and so on?
Well, maybe just one small start. There are certainly ways to teach those texts, I think, where you can kind of bring the kind of seams of the text, where there is friction, where the suturing is more obvious, or where it's just sort of under the surface, and try to bring those kind of seams and sutures to the surface of the text in class as a place, to sort of show the kind of work that's gone in to making something appear to be natural or seamless. But those are also potentially junctures where other combinations, other stories could have been made at those points. And so I think in class, those kinds of interventions, modest as they are, can be helpful and useful. That the construction of classics that we have is one that can be taken apart and shown in its kind of historical trajectories, and that there are sort of moments that you can teach where other threads might have been possible and other puttings together possible. Yeah.
So I'm very cautious about hogging the mic. So I'm going to try to be as short as possible, and I would love to follow this conversation up afterwards over wine. Okay. I won't speak for the Cause Collective, but I will make a point that is very much shaped by the work of cause. And it is that different national and geopolitical dispensations will see their own opportunities for engagement in and divestment from, like the hegemonic constitution of this discipline that in the Anglosphere has come to be designated classics, in other places is designated other things. I want to talk about Italy for a moment. I'm going to talk very briefly about Italy because there's this excellent book on Sebastiano Timpanaro that was written by Tom Goy that I would recommend strongly. So what's interesting about Timpanaro, who in one letter described himself as a modest rank-and-file member of the party, is that he operates outside the university setting. And even though he engages in work that in several crucial respects, like advances a somewhat tightly circumscribed view of a literary study in classics, he also does plenty outside of classics. So working on Leopardi, for instance. This is a person who had prolific interests, was able to realize them, but now we get to why I'm bringing up Timpanaro in the first place, did so outside the context of a university position, even as he remained very plugged into a universe of knowledge production that was institutionalized. And so what I would hold out as one possibility within particular national dispensations of ancient studies is that the prospects for pursuing various forms of emancipatory intellectual practice may look contingently different, but they may still nonetheless be united by an animating core commitment, right? And I mean, I think Timpanaro is a good case for that. He's not perfect. I mean, he has many flaws. But, you know, there's a way of recovering people like Timpanaro that can help you to think about how it might be that different national traditions nonetheless yield an oppositional consciousness. And that's something that would be sort of important to center. Okay, I promise I'll be even shorter about the derivation of words thing. So, I mean, in here, I mean, other folks should talk. Cella has done some excellent writing on divesting from genealogy as a mode, so I'm just going to put that on the table. Let me give you an example that I've been thinking a lot about because I spent the early part of this summer trying to wrestle down a book project that had various fits and starts. I was working on this project focused on how people think about ancient Greece and Rome in the Dominican Republic, which is where I was born. And one of the things that became an obsession for me years ago in teaching ancient etymology classes in English and also in Spanish is to show students the many paths that are traveled by the word bodega, which some of you may know is related to English apothecary. Bodega, it all traces origins all the way back to apotheke, right? But one could make this move and be like, ha-ha, see, this too is a Greek word, or one can tell a much richer cultural history about the circuits of bodega that bring us into dialogue with its various traffics in medieval and early modern Spanish, that bring us into the 19th and early 20th century solidification of the bodega as a repository for the distribution of wine. And from there, as the work of Carlos Sanabria has documented, bring us to the institution of the bodega in the context of the Puerto Rican diaspora. This seems like pretty awesome. But like to tell that story requires decathecting from the idea that the most important thing about this word is its origins in Greece or Rome. I mean, this is a player in the story, but it is not the authenticating force for the full range of cultural histories that could be told about and structured around this word, right? So this is why I'm bringing that up as an invitation to move past the game that would hold that derivation from Greek or Latin is what invests these words with some kind of like totemic force, right? Like that's really what I want to emphasize.
I think my answer to this goes in a couple of directions. One of those directions is political Muslimness, which speaks to the first point that Danelle made about oppositional consciousness. And the second point, I'm getting tired. I'm forgetting my own points. But before those two, the thing that I wanted to say is that Kieran has a great chapter in Cause about Marx's doctoral dissertation. And there's a certain sect of liberal classicists who love to wheel out Marx as, look, here is the radical potential of the classics that can be realized because Marx was also an ancient reader. No doubt, because as a 19th century German intellectual, the intellectual furniture was Greek and Latin. It actually isn't that, like, you're just pointing to his education system and going, like, isn't it amazing? Yes, that is also the intellectual theatre that created Theodor Herzl. So it's not as fancy a claim to the radical potential of the classics. I get angry because it's such an elision between some kind of like mystic potential of what the classics can do and actually what people have done with it. Yes, Marx wrote about Empedocles, and yes, there is historical materialism in Marxism, but how much Empedocles is necessary for the critiques of Marxism to thrive, and then the rich Marxist traditions in the plural that have therefore come from capital. Like, okay, so that's the kind of like removing the hood from the like, look, it could be useful for mounting critiques. The like ultimate test, or like the ultimate like go-to of liberal classicists is, look, Marx is on our team. And what Kieran's chapter does beautifully is to kind of deconstruct those moves. So that's kind of to the first point of like, look, this could be useful. Which brings me to political Muslimness. Okay, so I think somewhere wrapped up in the question as I understood it is classical knowledge can be useful when we want to be in the struggle. I'm praising, but like that's what I understood from your question, right? And this is something that Chella and I have had to think about really carefully about how we create and steward a community around political Muslimness when Islam is not a metaphor. There are Muslims in our collective. And what does it mean for us to make a critical ancient world studies that is plugged to, engaged by, and directed from a really serious thinking through of critical Muslim studies? Okay, so if we think about oppositionality to a current world order, we are engaged in political Muslimness. That's the limit of that claim. And how I think that speaks to your question is that we pick the tools with which we engage in intellectual and political struggle. The terrain is not limited to the exalted terrain as marked out to us by the current world order. Yes, where I'm trained, I have some very fancy degrees in classics. That is not the terrain on which we are going to win the bigger struggles. The kind of showmanship, I guess I'm struggling to think about what kind of struggles classical knowledge in the way that the discipline of classics would have us fight are really circumscribed, and I'm thinking about political struggle in this kind of like big way. I realize that might be quite, we might be missing each other in the night. Those are the things I wanted to say. Yeah.
Invitation to continue the conversation, over wine. Yeah, okay. So thanks so much to all of our panelists, and thanks to you guys for being here. And there's that abundance of alluring bottles over there, plus some grapes, okay, so.
What you were saying.
Also, if people want to go outside for a cigarette break or fresh air, just know that the doors lock outside, so you'll want to bring a key card. And if you happen to have a key card on your person and you're not using it, you can hang it up on the coat rack. Thank you.